Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my second lecture of the voyage and my first of four lectures about the Panama Canal. De Lesseps' Folly is the first one. By the way, my name is MacLachlan. I'm a geographer. I come from Lethbridge, Alberta. I'm a retired university professor. And my third career is being a university professor, but now in Shenzhen, China. So I've got four lectures lined up about the Panama Canal. We'll start out today with De Lesseps' Folly. Tomorrow I'm going to do Transiting the Panama Canal, a Day in the Ditch. And in that lecture, we will start from Limon Bay and work our way through the whole of the original Panama Canal. I think I'm going to skip a day. I'm going to talk about Cartagena, and then I'll do the Neo-Panamax era ditch digging, and we'll talk about the expansion of the canal and the new locks and how the canal changed. And finally, after we've got the Panama Canal in our wake, looking aft, we'll do a kind of a retrospective, and I'll talk about Panama Canal politics from a global perspective. So, four lectures. Today is all historical. I'll start out just saying a few words about the Isthmus of Panama. I'll talk about French canal history, challenges that were posed, the American canal history, motives and challenges. And this is one of the few lectures I give in which there's a moral to the story. I'm going to have the temerity to offer you with 5 life lessons from the Panama experience. So David McCullough's book is a masterpiece. A number of you have talked to me about it while I was chatting with people, so I'm sure many of you are aware of this book. If you're not, I recommend it very highly. It's popular history, but it's a wonderful story. It's a long book. It runs to 600 pages. Jimmy Carter once said that the treaties that were passed to provide control of the Panama Canal to Panama would never have been passed if this book was not there for people to read in the legislative process, and it was quoted by both sides in those debates. David McCullough was died in 2022. He was a popular historian. He wrote wonderful stories about the Brooklyn Bridge, about the Wright brothers, about Harry Truman. And he narrated American Experience on PBS. Maybe you remember some of his programs. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by George W. in 2006. So this is a source that certainly I lean on very heavily. It's hugely detailed. I've got 45 minutes. I'm going to have to cherry pick. I can't cover all of the details. Hopefully, I'm going to whet your interest to read this excellent treatment. So in Panama City, you will find a statue to Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who made his way across the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean on the other side and reported back to Spain about that. He's the first European that sees the other side of the isthmus. Do we think of this as a barrier to intercourse across the oceans, or do we think of it as a bridge joining North America to South America? By the way, it's a very recent bridge, only about 3 million years old. It was one of the last little bits of the American continent writ large that becomes established. And because it was late in arriving, it accounts for a lot of the species differences that we have between North America and South America. Well, if Balboa was the first to get to the other side of the isthmus. It was, of all people, the Scots in 1698 who wanted to settle on the isthmus in a pioneering settlement on Caledonian Bay called New Edinburgh. And it was an utter and complete disaster. They brought 200 settlers, and 150 of them died. My numbers are wrong. 300 of 1,200 survived. 900 died. They died of disease. They died because they didn't know how to manage in the tropics, and they died because the Spanish came and killed them. It was not the only European colony in the Americas to go terribly wrong. Consider the Roanoke colony. Consider the Jamestown settlement. Consider Ile St. Croix in what is now Nova Scotia. So lots of these things went wrong. The first experience, and there's Caledonian Bay, just a little bit north of a part of the Isthmus of Panama that we call the Darien Gap, immediately south of the Gulf of Darien. So the Darien Gap represents an intervening unlinked space between the northern end of the Pan American Highway that ends in Yavisa in southern Panama, and the northern end of the southern part of the Pan American Highway that ends in this coastal settlement in Colombia called Turbo. There was no Pan American Highway infrastructure ever built between those. And until about 10 years ago, we thought of the Darien Gap as completely untraveled, only crossed by a few crazy adventurers, but in extremely small numbers. And since that time, of course, the flow of refugees through the Darien Gap has gone from a trickle to a torrent. This is from the New York Times. CNN did a program that talked about the terrible challenges, the risk of death and robbery, and the wicked environmental conditions that people struggle through. More than 360,000 people have traveled through the Darien Gap in 2023. So this is a big volume of people struggling north, most of them coming from Venezuela and Colombia, but all kinds of other nationalities as well, struggling north through the Darien Gap and north into Central America. So the Darien Gap is not the completely untraveled wilderness that it once was. The first successful large-scale crossing of the Isthmus of Panama goes back to the America's first transcontinental railroad. It was put through between 1849 and 1855. You're probably thinking 1849, 49ers, Sutter's Mill. This was the gold rush. This was the greatest gold rush that North America ever saw. And how did people get from the East Coast to where there weren't nearly enough opportunities and jobs to the West Coast, where this fabulous bounty lay apparently on the ground there to be picked up. Some ships went south of Cape Horn. Other people made their way across the U.S. Some of them in the early days were crossing at Nicaragua. But that first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1855, 47.5 miles long. That's a pretty short transcontinental railroad. They used the same gauge as the southern railways of the U.S., 5-foot gauge, and between 5,000 and 12,000 people died putting that railway in. So it was a pretty risky business to work on it. a lot of those workers were Chinese indentured laborers. Just 14 years later, the Central Pacific will meet the Union Pacific at Promontory Summit in Utah, and the U.S. will be bridged by ribbons of steel. And 30 years after the Panama Railroad, the CPR will be completed in Canada. So the Panama Railroad was the first. And we can see the route that it takes. It actually runs from Colon, that we'll be seeing in just a few days, on the east side of Limon Bay and Monkey Hill. And for much of its route, once it reaches Gatun, it follows the Chagres River until it cuts south through the Culebra Cut. And that Culebra Cut is something you're going to hear about. It's one of the most spectacular points on the canal. It's the point where the railroad was going over the Continental Divide and down into what is now Panama City. So Culebra was one of the great challenges for the railroad at 275 feet above sea level. It's not nearly as high above sea level as the Union Pacific was, but we got to remember that they had to get up to 275 feet in just a very few miles from sea level. So that was a challenge. The Panama Railroad was connecting the Caribbean, which is a nearly tideless sea in most areas, tidal range of 2 feet at Colon, and not quite tideless, but relatively modest. When we get to the Pacific side, a tidal variation of 21 feet, much more tide on the Pacific side. That has implications if you're going to try and build a canal at sea level between the two. So that's the railroad. It's there, it's operating, it's bringing miners both ways across the isthmus, and provides a speedy route across the continent. The trick is the long steamer ride from New York or wherever on the eastern seaboard down to Colon, and then the other steamer route up to San Francisco on the Pacific side. So let's leave the isthmus aside and talk about Ferdinand de Lesseps. He's a 19th century man. He's born in 1805 and dies in 1894. Works as a diplomat in different capitals in Europe. He's the vice consul, a very high diplomatic position in Alexandria in Egypt. And of course, the French were very active in Egypt, going right back to Napoleon. And they were aware of the Canal of the Pharaohs, the canal that ran from the Nile River into the Gulf of Suez. And with that in mind, he retires from the diplomatic service in 1853, leaving time to do something else, kind of like what I did, actually, leaving my one university job. And he has it in mind that he's going to be the entrepreneur, the leader in this construction of the Suez Canal. He is successful. It's built over a period of 10 years, from 1859 to 1869. So it takes him 6 years to kind of get all the money, the financing, the surveys into place, and then builds the canal in 10 years. And then he retires again to collect his honors and reflect on his achievement. There's the Suez Canal. It's 120 miles long, more than twice as long as the Panama Canal. Took a long time to build it. Unlike Panama today, it only could sustain one-way traffic, and the way they organized that with a system of convoys. Convoys aren't used in Panama, but they are used in that Suez Canal system, with a passing area in the Great Bitter Lake. When we look at the Suez Canal, it's immediately apparent this is a whole different kind of world from the Isthmus of Panama. One, it's dry, and two, the topography is low and forgiving. So it's a whole lot easier to dig There might be a lot of digging, but the digging is pretty routine because there aren't a lot of high slopes that are going to have landslips, making digging more difficult. So, having had that enormous achievement, de Lesseps retires, rests on his laurels for a while, and he gets it into his head to lead in another great canal. He wants to do something more with his life before he's finished. And so he brings together some of the greatest minds in Europe in a technical age, in a country with a long tradition of engineering and canal building. So the Congrès International d'Études du Canal Interocéanique is convened in 1879. This is the International Congress for Studying an Interoceanic Canal. He's there as the leading delegate. One of the other important characters who there is Alexandre Gustave Eiffel, and he's an engineer who is probably better known 10 years after 1879 for building the Eiffel Tower as the center point of the Paris World's Fair. So he was there, all kinds of maritime engineers, to discuss the issues connected with building yet another canal of some size. Two key issues: where should the canal be built, and what kind of canal would it be? Would it be a sea level canal, or would it have locks? A canal with locks is sometimes called a summit canal because it climbs up to a summit and then climbs back down again using pound locks invented by the Chinese over 1,000 years ago. There really were three potential canal locations. First, there was the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This is in Mexico. It leads into the Gulf of Mexico, 124 miles, kind of a long way to dig, a little bit longer than Suez. The terrain was moderate. It was one opportunity that didn't find great favor, although we're going to talk about that. There have been some more recent ideas about bridging that Isthmus of Tehuantepec. There was Lake Nicaragua, 170 miles long. It was the longest one, but it used Lake Nicaragua as a key part of the canal. That didn't need to be dug out. It was a deep lake. It was a big lake, vastly bigger than Lake Gatun. So there would be a ready supply of water to provide the hydraulic juice to drive a summit canal. And then there was the Isthmus of Panama. Well, the shortest, only 44 miles as the crow flies, but over a daunting Cordilleran obstacle that runs the spine that runs the length of the Americas, and cutting through that would be difficult. It's also much further south, a much bigger rain season, much more rain, more torrential rain, and a river runs through it. The Chagres River posed a serious obstacle. So this was debated by these learned figures, and anything might have happened. I think there was a lot of support for the Lake Nicaragua route, but de Lesseps was really convinced from the outset. He was getting all these people together to tell him what he wanted to hear, and he really didn't want to hear anything that contradicted his pre-apprehensions. So what was de Lesseps' folly in just a few words? Well, learning the wrong lessons from Suez. What had worked very well at Suez, a sea level canal, and using the Isthmus of Suez, using the narrowest single point, the Isthmus of Panama. He was convinced that was the only option available. Using David McCulloch's words, he had a jaunty disregard for technical problems, refused to heed the recognized authorities that he brought together from all over the world, brought together smart people but didn't want to listen to them, and an unshakable faith in his own infallibility. Have you ever met anybody like that? Yeah, so that was de Lesseps' Folly. This is what they conceived the canal would look like. It would be a sea-level canal from Limon Bay all the way up. There we go into the Culebra Cut and coming out on the Pacific Ocean side. And what they're going to do about the tidal differences is not indicated or shown on the map. But imagine the tidal flow, 20 feet of tide roaring up and down the canal twice a day. And what would that do to all of the sediment? I mean, it would just cause it to cave in. And once you dig that out, then it's going to cave in again. Second, we've got the Chagres River. This was a raging torrent during the rainy season. De Lesseps went to Panama several times, but just like us, he went in the dry season. He didn't go in the wet season. That's rather inconvenient to have to wear rain gear wherever you go. The rainy season in Panama, it wasn't this year, but it's normally very, very impressive. And the Chagres River rises during that rain, so it becomes an engineering challenge. And finally, the Culebra Cut. Imagine cutting at Culebra all the way down to sea level. It would have been, it's already an impressive cut, but to get down to sea level, it would be even more impressive. So, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. De Lesseps prevailed against perhaps some wiser heads who suggested other options. And under de Lesseps' leadership, excavation began in 1881. And they started digging, and immediately they discovered all kinds of problems that they were told about beforehand, but he really hadn't listened to, and he wasn't experiencing them himself because he was back home in France. The heat and humidity was just incredible. Torrential rains played havoc with soil stability, and that caused landslides. So they dig out, and then there'd be another landslide, dig again, another landslide. It was described as running your fingers through grain. As soon as your finger passes, you can't even see where you were digging. On top of climatic problems and soil stability, there was the world's most dangerous animals. What are the world's most dangerous animals? I know that many of you already know Anopheles gambii, the vector of Plasmodium falciparum. Plasmodium falciparum is a protozoan, and that's the protozoan that causes malaria. And what happened? I can see it and you can't. My apologies. There. Anopheles gambii, that's the mosquito. Plasmodium falciparum is the protozoan that the mosquito vectors, and that's the protozoan that causes the malaria. This kills millions every year, even up to the present, but it killed a lot of the workers that France had brought in from the West Indies. The other one was Aedes aegypti. This was the vector of both yellow fever and the dengue fever virus. So disease was killing off workers all the time, hundreds of workers falling victim to disease every month. Things were so bad that eventually there was a rebellion by the workers on the canal. It was led by this guy, Pedro Prestan. He burns down Colon. He leads a rebellion. Eventually, they bring in enough troops to put the rebellion down, and he and the other ringleaders were tried, and they played the supreme sacrifice. But this was just further indication of all the wheels falling off. After 8 years of excavation, there's de Lesseps in a trench that seems to go on forever. About 20,000 fatalities on the canal to date, not counting the fatalities on the railroad before that. Malaria and yellow fever were out of control. Accidents involving machinery, they didn't have the OSHA requirements that we have today. Those landslides were drowning men in mud and clay. They were years behind schedule. And finally, financial collapse in 1889. The canal company is insolvent and bankrupt. A liquidator was appointed on February the 4th, 1889. Some 800,000 French people were in the early days of capitalism trying to save their money for their retirement. 800,000 lost their life savings. Panama became synonymous with a boondoggle. It was a national embarrassment for the French. France did manage to do almost a third of the excavation in the present-day canal, but at a terrible cost. They were ahead of their time in the wrong way. They were trying to do a job that the medical science wasn't quite ready. The technology wasn't quite ready. It would be far more advanced in just 20 years when construction is restarted. So that was they just weren't quite technologically or medically ready. This is a little inlet on the canal at sea level on the Caribbean side. And that is something that we'll see the morning we go through the canal. That's the one bit of French excavation that is still visible on the Panama Canal. We see it very early in the trip. So they did some of the initial digging that helped later on, but a lot of what they did was completely a wasted effort. So the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique is no more. A lot of people have lost a lot of money. And one of the shareholders we're going to hear from in a few minutes, his name is Philippe Bueno Varilla. So that's 1889. Let's jump ahead. De Lesseps dies in 1894. Let's jump ahead to 1898, when this lovely, nearly new armored cruiser, the Maine, is in Havana Harbor. This is the latest design for battleships and cruisers. They have the inverted bow. We don't see them anymore on ships of war. This was a feature of ships in the late 80s, 90s, up to World War II. And then ship design goes in the opposite direction. We have lovely raked bows like Viking Sea has. But it's interesting, everything that's old is new again. Some of the expedition ships are starting to be built with a inverted bow like the Maine. This is a state-of-the-art ship. It has masts, but they don't hold sails. They're just there for signal flags. Notice that the turrets are they can fire broadsides. They can't fire straight ahead because they shoot the mast off. So this is a kind of a transitional vessel on the way to the modern battleship. And on February the 15th, 1898, it blows up. 260 men are killed. And in the cemetery at Key West that we sailed by just yesterday morning, can you believe it? There's a wonderful monument to the to the men who were killed in that terrible explosion that had enormous impact on the American people, and the famous maxim, "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain." Even though they weren't quite sure what caused the explosion. It was in Havana Harbor, all right. We'll never know for sure. Some people think it was sabotage by the Spanish in their colony. Other people argue that this was a boiler blowing up. It wasn't Spain's fault at all. Never mind. This was the basis for the Spanish-American War, one of the shortest wars in U.S. history, only 10 weeks long, one of the most successful. The Oregon, the battleship that they really wanted to have to provide firepower in the Caribbean, was on the western side of the continent, and they called for the Oregon to come to provide fire support for the blockade of Santiago de Cuba. And so it comes flying down the coast of the Americas, all the way down, following the Green Line, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, and all the way back up again. It takes 67 days, and really, by the time it got there, it wasn't needed. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July the 3rd saw the whole Spanish fleet sunk. The U.S. was victorious. That was the end of the war. They really didn't need the USS Oregon to do that. The U.S. gains Guam. They gain the Philippines. They gain Puerto Rico. And Cuba becomes independent. But it's an indication that if the U.S. is going to become dominant in the Caribbean and see Monroe's doctrine really defended seriously with a blue water navy, they've got to have a way of getting those warships from the Pacific to the Caribbean and into the Atlantic more rapidly. So strategically, the Spanish-American War provides an enormous incentive and motive for an American Panama Canal in place of the French failure. Well, how is the U.S. going to do that? It was a long series of diplomatic moves and counter moves in the early part of the 20th century that saw Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French investor in the interoceanic company that de Lesseps had brought together. He'd lost a whole bunch of money, and he wanted to get some of that back. And he wanted to see the French, the remnants of that company, sell their assets to the U.S. The U.S. would only buy those assets if it had the territory on which to build the canal. So between Teddy Roosevelt and Bunau-Varilla, a rebellion is orchestrated in Colombia that sees a province of Colombia called Panama rebel against the nascent country of Colombia that's just gotten its independence from Spain a few decades earlier. Panama becomes independent of Colombia, and in days, Bunau-Varilla, a Frenchman, who wasn't born in Panama, wasn't a citizen of Panama. Panama really didn't yet have all of the furniture of statehood. He represents Panama and signs for Panama as its plenipotentiary. And so with the American Secretary of State, John Hay, the Bunau-Varilla Treaty is signed in November of 1903. Teddy Roosevelt now has dedicated perpetual control over the canal zone. And there he is in his little backyard pond that is the Caribbean, walking softly and carrying a big stick. So it's time to pick up the pieces left behind by by the Lesseps. The Lesseps is dead. The pieces are purchased for $40 million, and they establish an engineer to do the work. His name was John Findlay Wallace. And his mandate was make the dirt fly. In the interpretation that we get from David McCulloch, that seems quite reasonable to me, he was a guy who put second things first over and over again. He wasn't without achievement. He wouldn't have been appointed if he didn't have wonderful credentials as a railway engineer. He played an important role in the Illinois Central. But running something as big and complicated as Panama Canal construction, maybe that was a little more than he could handle. He goes to Panama, and right away he starts to dig. They don't even know yet whether it's going to be a sea level canal or it's going to have locks. They haven't made those decisions. And as he digs, he begins to discover many of the problems that the French had discovered. So instead of taking some time to plan and figure out exactly what they ought to do, he made the dirt fly. And sadly, failed completely. So the U.S., after the first 2 years of getting control over the canal zone, it's sort of repeating all of the mistakes that the French had made, and the U.S. was in some disarray. John Findlay Wallace quits, and a new engineer is brought in. This is John Stevens. Stop digging. What is the real problem here? And that can be a great challenge, but that's what he did. He realized that health was still an issue, malaria was still an issue, yellow fever was still an issue. So to build a canal, he had to manage public health. That's not about digging. That's about controlling the vectors. That's about sanitation, about decent diets for hardworking manual laborers, and decent housing for those workers. He realized that material handling was one of the problems. They were moving massive quantities of material on a one-track railway on that Panama Railroad. The first thing they had to do was double-track the Panama Railroad so they could begin to move the tons and tons of material more efficiently. And he had to decide, what was it going to be? Was it going to be sea level, or was it going to be a summit canal? This is finally settled a year into John Stevens' tenure in 1906. And then the canal is completed only 8 years after that. So the decision is made in June 1906, and once things seem to be on an even keel, the president comes. First time a sitting president has left the United States. There's Theodore Roosevelt discovering the photo op. He's in this huge Bucyrus excavating machine, and he's having a great time. He's moving the levers and the thing's going up and down. And look at this worker perched up here. His job is to hold the rope out of the way so they get a good picture of the president. But it was that engineer figuring out, what do we need to do first, that was so important in getting things back going. And then we get the stamp of the president being there. Confidence is restored. It's going to be a summit canal with locks. They've got to convert rainfall, which was a huge problem, into a resource. And that resource, of course, was water. That water was held back by a great dam. And the dam had to be built to build a canal. That's the spillway of the Gatun Dam. That's the fancy part. Most of the dam is earthen, and it just looks like a golf course without any bunkers on it. That earthen dam is critical to hold back Lake Gatun, and that provides the kinetic energy for the canal operations, the operation of the locks, controls the Chagres River. And in damming the Chagres River, creating the largest artificial lake anywhere in the world. Thousands of people were dispossessed. I can't imagine how it would be done today, but it was done back then. Controlling all those disease was a matter of mosquito control, lots of pyrethrum sprayed everywhere, and oil, sheets of oil laid over top of stagnant water to prevent the insects from laying their eggs in the water. There's the Culebra Cut, Gold Hill on the left, Contractor Hill on the right. They're still there. This was the great earth-moving challenge to dig that, and they would dig and dig and dig, and then it would all cave in, and they'd have to start over again. The challenge was managing. Today you dig, tomorrow it slides. The challenge was managing the angle of repose, finding just the right slope where the slope will be stable. And that depends on the angularity of the particles and the size of the particles. So fine sand, it has an angle of repose of about 35 degrees. Angular pebbles can get steeper. But as soon as it rains, then all bets are off and things start sliding anyway. So that was the enormous challenge of moving that material in the Culebra Cut. It was like running your hand through grain. They lowered the summit of the cut from 194 feet to 39 feet above sea level, excavating 100 million cubic yards, 30% more than they had intended on doing. And this work was all done by an American military engineer, David Dubose Guillard, and he died just before the canal was finished. He dies in 1913. So the Culebra Cut gets named the Guillard Cut. The two L's are turned into a Y. The Guillard Cut. And it was called the Guillard Cut until Panama got control of the canal. They changed the name back to the Culebra Cut. So we call it Culebra or Guillard. It's the same cut. And this diagram shows quite graphically how much material had to be moved. The more you go down, the more you got to go out. The more you go down, the more you go out. And all of this material had to be moved. So building a canal was about building railroads. And railroads were critical of the movement of the material. So there we are in 1913. They were approaching the final joining of the Atlantic and the Pacific. And it comes down to pick and shovel work to link those two together in fall of 1913. And there is steamship Ancon making the first official transit of the Panama Canal, 15th of August, 1914. 3 days before that, Britain and France had declared war on Austria-Hungary. And so the Panama Canal was completed and first inaugurated at the very moment in history when World War I began. Who did all that work? Lots of skilled workers, engineers and professionals, and they were paid in gold. 50,000 laborers, mainly from the Caribbean, living in segregated quarters, segregated dining, segregated eating. They were paid in silver. 5,600 died under the American initiative. That was a small fraction of the 20,000 who died under French management. So the butcher's bill was enormous. What can we learn? I got 3 minutes left. What can we learn from the Panama Canal? Life lessons. The law of the instrument, Maslow's hammer, the tendency to over-rely on a familiar tool. According to Abraham Maslow, I know many of you met Abraham Maslow in university, I suppose it is tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. The Suez Canal as that familiar Maslow's hammer. Just how much status do you need? There's de Lesseps. He refuses just to retire, to reflect, to take it easy. He's got to be the winner. He's got to achieve one more thing. There he is in this cartoon with the maritime signal flag for uniform, which ships fly to each other when the signal is you are running into danger. So maybe one success should be enough for anyone. Rest on your laurels. Or quit while you are ahead. 3, well, the French wanted to make a success of this thing. There was will there, but just wanting to do it is not enough. You've got to have other things in place. The Americans might have repeated that French error had it not been for the breakthroughs in the control of yellow fever by controlling the mosquito larvae. If it had not been a railway age where railways had capacities in the early 20th century that the French didn't have in the 1880s. Had it not been for John Stevens putting first things first, to build a canal, you've got to have healthy workers. To build a canal, you've got to manage housing and disease, materials management. Had it not been for electrical generation, the dam would not have had the great role that it had in controlling Lake Thun. So we could say that timing is everything. Remember John Findlay Wallace. He started the job, make the dirt fly. That's what he was told, and he wanted to show that he was doing things. So he started doing things right away. We have this 100-day phenomenon where we expect leaders to start doing good stuff right away instead of letting them sit back and just figure out what's going on, what's the real problem. Erwin Rommel, the desert fox, time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. Or we could say, look before you leap. Maybe there's a more positive lesson to be learned, and I want to quote, I know I've sounded critical, but Teddy Roosevelt is an amazing figure. A more positive lesson comes from a quote that Teddy gave. There he is climbing onto the Bucyrus excavator. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the great twilight that knows not victory or defeat. In other words, no guts, no glory. So there are 5 life lessons that I've been thinking about in relation to the history of the Panama Canal. I hope there are things that you might like to think about too. I thank you so much for your patience and for coming in out of that lovely warm day to sit in this dark room and learn about the history of the Panama Canal. Be right back here tomorrow, and we're going to talk about a day in the ditch and a lock by lock, what to expect when we go through the canal. Thank you so much.